for themselves to feel better.
Well, I know that you teach workshops and also courses, but supposing somebody comes to you individually for individual work. Now, you have a number of practices, as you've already said, but how do you work then? How do you know what to use with whom?
A lot is intuitive, using intuition. I don't always talk about this outright, but when people come to see me, what I believe is from the moment they first decide to call, their guides and my guides are in conference, thinking about what would be the highest priority work for that session, what would have the most impact, what would be the most helpful. So in energy medicine by itself, without talking about any of these other modalities, there are many, many, many protocols. And there are many more specific and energy checks and exercises to bring this thing or that thing into balance. I like to start with those energy medicine balances that Donna thinks of as part of the daily routine, or some basic things that are often off with almost everyone I encounter who thinks they need a session. Because once you bring the body into balance, then everything you do is going to be more effective. And those are things that the person can learn and take home with them and keep doing. And I think, a lot of people come into energy medicine, energy work from being massage therapists, so they're used to doing work as a practitioner with the person on a table. But I really come in as a teacher, wanting to empower people to learn what I've learned to overcome kind of the negative predictions that are so common in the medical world, that you're given not just a name of a disease, a diagnosis, but a negative prediction about how sick you're going to be and how much you're going to need this intervention or that, these drugs for life. It's not a very hopeful approach. But what I've learned, because I've overcome so many things that were supposed to keep me from being active, so I've learned that you can do that. So that's really, when someone comes to see me, I want them to leave feeling as hopeful about their situation as I'm feeling. So I like to start with energy balances, with testing, with kind of introducing them to the concept of testing energy and how quickly it can correct and how you can see and feel that correction. Often then in talking to someone, they'll mention a trauma. So an example is, I was just talking to my sister-in-law. She hasn't been feeling well. And then she mentioned that just before all these particular symptoms that she'd mentioned, she had fallen. And so when someone mentions a trauma like that, right away a bell kind of goes off in my head. And so that would be probably the first place I would go after doing the initial balancing. Is there's a number of ways to work with trauma. One of my favorites is TAPA's acupressure technique, but it's not the only way, and it's not important what way. The important thing is the focus and the presence and the dropping down and working from really an altered space, not from a linear point of view. That when trauma happens in the body, is a part of the brain, we call a mammalian brain, that doesn't know that the trauma has ended. And the emotion that's set up, like shock, fear, stays in place and holds everything kind of static. And that interferes with the body's ability to heal itself. So when you treat the trauma, the history hasn't changed, but the retained energy distortions, if you will, get addressed. And so then the body has more resource available to heal itself.
So in other words, if you don't take care of the suppressed emotion on the trauma, then the symptoms will remain. Is that right?
Exactly. And they'll not just remain, but they'll often keep escalating. In part, I think this is, how I frame it to myself. Other people might have a different framework, but I think the body just keeps trying to get our attention to what it needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so there might be a pain in a specific place. Unfortunately, then, if you go to an allopathic physician, they'll focus on the place where the pain is, but they might not make the connections of, oh, something was jarred when you fell, and there's still some emotion left behind that. We separate things. So if you go to a doctor and say that you are depressed, then they don't want to treat the depression. They want to send you to a psychologist. But then you might say, I'm depressed and I'm not sleeping well and I have a headache. But that all might be coming from the same issue, and it might be coming from a trauma. And the other thing that's interesting, I mentioned my sister-in-law that she'd fallen recently, but someone might have a trauma from when they were 3 years old, and they've been fine for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and then all of a sudden something will show up that looks like a chronic illness, and it actually is connected to this trauma that they don't even have any conscious memory of.
You mean something triggers that trauma, and so the symptoms arise, is that right?
Yes, and whatever triggered it might not be a conscious thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, who knows what the triggers may be. They might see someone that looks like someone that was around them at the time of the trauma, but it might not even be that clear or that direct. And using kinesiology, which we also call energy testing, you can find out how far back you need to go to treat the trauma, and without knowing what it is, the body will still be able to, the body knows, and can still release it without having to identify or go into kind of a place where abreaction is possible of going through the details of the trauma. So it's a way of also separating from the story, but treating what's left on an energetic level, mm-hmm. and still having an impact.
Well, what do you see as the goal when someone comes to you? What is the goal to you of what you're trying to achieve?
Well, for me, I hope that they'll experience greater freedom. And I hope that I will be neutral enough about what the goal ought to be to really listen deeply to know what they want from the session, so that I'm not imposing on them that they should have, greater this or more that or whatever, but that it can be driven by what they're seeing in their life that they want most.
So you see yourself as empowering them, is that correct?
Yes, and facilitating their process. I mean, in my own process, I'm very aware that there's multiple levels of meaning, and if I'm encountering something that you could say, an obstacle that in my path, that there's meaning in that, and that there's metaphor in it, and often the body's way of expressing itself is metaphorically. So I'm inclined to move in that direction. So if somebody comes to me and they have persistent shoulder pain, I might right away, what might come to me is ask them, what burdens are you shouldering? Are you soldiering on? Because it sounds so much like shoulder to soldier. Very often people are overextending, and if you think about how your arm moves, when you're overextending, then you might get a strain in your shoulder, but the overextension might not be leaning too far, but it might be more on a metaphorical level.